In 1983, a mother and her young son vanished from their remote farmhouse in Sonoma County. No sign of a break-in, no note, just an open vineyard gate and silence. 30 years later, my daughter drew a picture of a boy she claimed lived in our house. Said his name was Julian. Said his mom was sad. We thought it was just imagination until the floor caved in. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury and make sure no name stays forgotten. I'm Sarah Rhodes. I was 42 when we moved to that vineyard. My husband Callum had just stepped away from the software company he'd built from scratch, and I think I was just trying to figure out what came next. We'd lived in Sacramento most of our lives. Regular neighborhood block parties, school runs weekend, Target trips. But after years of missed dinners and a house that never quite felt like home, we both agreed something quieter might be good for us, especially for Sophie. She was 6 then, quiet, artistic, quiet. She'd started drawing more than talking, and when the opportunity came up to buy 10 acres of vineyard land way below market price, we didn't ask too many questions. We just packed the boxes and went. The place was called Dial Hill. We didn't know much about its history, just that the house needed work and the land had gone fallow years ago. On the drive-in, I remember the vines looked like twisted wires. The shutters were cracked, one of them banging lightly in the wind. Callum tried to lighten the mood, said it had good bones. But I remember standing in that doorway, dust heavy in the air, thinking it felt like we were intruding. We started fixing it up, little by little. Callum handled the barn and the vineyard rows. I focused on the house, sorting through what had been left behind, peeling back years of dust and mildew. Sophie took to wandering sketch pad in hand, drawing trees and shadows and things she said she saw in the windows. At first, I chalked it up to adjustment. New place, new smells. Kids imagine things. But then one afternoon, I passed her room and saw a picture taped to the wall. It showed a boy standing behind a curtain watching. His face was solemn, too detailed for a 6-year-old. I asked her who it was. "His name's Julian," she said. "He lives here." I tried to keep my voice even. "You mean like pretend no? He talks to me when you're busy. He says his mom's sad." That night, I didn't sleep much. About a week later, the kitchen floor gave way under Sophie. We'd started renovations in there. Some of the subfloor was already stripped down. She'd been standing near the window, and the next second she was gone. Just a scream, and then silence. Callum got to her first. She was scraped up, but okay. The floor had collapsed over what we assumed was just a crawl space until the flashlight caught something down there. Cement cracked open by time, and something caught in the fracture. Something that looked human. The police came. They sealed off the kitchen. They told us it would take a few days to run tests, but from the look on the deputy's face, we already knew it wasn't new. It had been there a long time. And that was the night I started asking questions, the kind that didn't go away. Because the next morning I woke up early before Sophie, before Callum, and went to the porch with my coffee. There was fog across the vineyard, thick low, the kind that moved like it was alive. And I could swear, down by the trellis line just for a second, someone was standing there. But when I called out, no one answered. The day after, I thought I saw someone down near the trellis the sheriff's office called. The remains under our kitchen floor had been identified. Female, early 30s, cause of death still pending, but dental records confirmed it. Her name was Margot Dial. I remember standing by the window when I got the call, staring out at the vines. They'd just started greening up in that way they do in spring when everything still feels possible. And then her name landed in my ear like a stone in a still pond. The deputy said they were treating it as a homicide now, said they'd be reopening the case. I said thank you, but I don't think I meant it. That night, I didn't tell Callum right away. He was trying in his own way, focusing on the contractors, checking off lists, acting like we could still turn the place into a fresh start. Sophie was quiet too. She'd been spending more time in her room since the floor collapse, drawing mostly. I gave her space. We all needed it. The next morning, after I got her settled with her sketch pad and Callum disappeared into a phone call in the den, I opened my laptop. I wasn't even sure what I was searching for, just typed her name. Margot Dial Disappearance, 1983, Sonoma County. The results weren't much. A few old forum posts, some scattered mentions in comment threads. But then I found a digital archive for the Santa Rosa Daily Ledger. August 19, 1983. A 3-paragraph article, boy presumed drowned after vineyard disappearance. That was it. No quotes from the mother, no updates, no photo. Julian's name appeared once. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't feel like a death notice. It felt like someone trying to shut a door. That afternoon, I drove into town, left Callum with Sophie, and told him I needed to pick up paint samples. The Sonoma County Historical Archive was wedged between a bakery and an old frame shop. Inside, a bell jingled when I stepped through the door, and the air smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. A volunteer pointed me toward the microfilm reader in the back. I found the 1983 drawer and began scanning through the frames one slide at a time, pausing on anything that mentioned the Dial name or the vineyard. After maybe half an hour, I landed on a black and white photo, grainy but clear enough. The Dial Hill Vineyard Harvest Festival taken months before Jean Dial's death. Margot stood near a tasting table, smiling but stiff. Jean had Julian in one arm, and to his right was another man, shorter, wiry, thinning hair. His hand rested on Julian's shoulder. Arthur Emmons. The name I'd seen on the property transfer. The man who sold us the house. I printed the photo and slipped it into my bag. 3 blocks away, I knocked on the door of a small green bungalow with lace curtains in the window boxes. Mildred Habersham answered. She was in her 70s, maybe older, but sharp-eyed and cautious. When I introduced myself, her expression didn't change, but she opened the door and led me to a small sunroom in the back. We sat over lukewarm tea, and I asked her about Margot. Mildred didn't hesitate. Margot wasn't crazy, she said. People said she was. But I saw her that summer, the July before she disappeared. She came to my house one evening shaking like a leaf. Said someone had been walking near the house at night, that Julian had seen a man watching them from the vines. I asked if Margot had told her who it was. She shook her head. No. Said she didn't know his name, but she was going to the sheriff. I told her I'd go with her the next morning. She never came back. I pulled out the photo and asked if she recognized anyone. Mildred's eyes locked on Arthur's face. She didn't speak for a few seconds. Then she said, "That's Arthur Emmons. He and Jean co-owned the vineyard for years. After Jean died and Margot disappeared, Arthur took over." Her voice dropped a bit. Didn't do right by the place. That evening, after Sophie went to bed, I walked down to the barn. The sun had just dropped behind the hills, leaving everything gold and quiet. The barn leaned a little to the side, like it was tired of standing. Inside, the smell hit me first dust rust, old dirt. Tools were scattered on a pegboard, and there were crates of cracked glass and what looked like disused wine racks. In the far corner, something caught my eye. A small glint half buried under a pile of old sacks and crumbling pots. I knelt down and pulled it out, a rusted chain with a small pendant at the end. I turned it over. The engraving was faint, but still clear enough, J.D. Julian Dial. I didn't say anything when I brought it to the sheriff's office the next morning, just handed over the bag and explained where I'd found it. Deputy Barron took it, held it carefully in her gloved hands, then let out a low breath. "It's compelling," she said, "but not conclusive. I asked how it could not be. It belonged to a boy who vanished. It was found 20 feet from where he was last seen." She nodded. "I believe you, but belief doesn't build a case. Not after 30 years. Back home, I couldn't let it go. I dug deeper. Went to the county records office, asked for anything they had on Jean Dial's death. The clerk brought out a folder, thumbing through the brittle pages like he was sorting coupons. He warned me some of it had been lost during digitization in the 90s. I scanned the autopsy report. It read like it had been written by someone with their hands tied. Cause of death, blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. No mention of bruising, no diagram, no photos. That led me to Elaine Kramer, daughter of Deputy Kramer, who'd worked the Dial case. She still lived in the same house on the edge of town. The living room hadn't changed in years. Old plaid armchairs, ceramic figurines lined up on a mantel. She brought out a cedar chest from under the window. My dad didn't trust the system to keep track, she said. Inside, I found a folder marked Dial Cases, 1982 to 83. I flipped through until something caught my eye, a handwritten note about Jean's injuries. Bruising on back of head inconsistent with single-point fall. Entry wound shallow. No indication of forward momentum. Pattern suggests backward force, possible strike. I read it twice. Elaine saw my expression and nodded. He talked about it, said something wasn't right, but he never had enough to push it. That night I laid the folder out on the kitchen table while Callum organized receipts nearby. I showed him the notes. The pendant. The photo. He stared at the pages, then leaned back, arms crossed. Sarah, he said, we're not detectives. We moved here to start over, not dig through someone else's graves. I told him this wasn't just curiosity. Margot didn't vanish. Julian didn't wander off. Jean didn't fall. There's a pattern here, I said. He sighed, rubbed his eyes. Then, what? You go back to the sheriff and say what this place is haunted. I didn't answer, because I knew what I'd felt, what I'd heard. Around 2 a.m., I was still awake. The house creaked the way it always did, deep and low, like old bones shifting. Then I heard the soft pat of footsteps in the hallway. Sophie's voice, barely above a whisper. Mom? She was standing there barefoot, eyes wide. I saw him again, she said. Julian. I knelt down. It was just a dream, honey. She shook her head. He said he couldn't breathe, said he was stuck, that the air was gone. I tried to help him. I tried. I pulled her close. Her body trembled against mine. I told her it was okay, that she was safe now. But the look in her eyes said she knew something I didn't. By the time I tucked her back into bed, I had already made up my mind. Whatever Margot had hidden, whatever this place was trying to tell us, it wasn't finished. Not yet. I brought the letter to the sheriff's office the next morning. Margot's handwriting was faint slanted across the yellowed paper, but every word was clear. She said if anything happened to her, it wasn't by choice, that Jean didn't fall, that someone tried to hurt Julian. I sat across from Sheriff Baird while he read it, his brow barely moving. When he finished, he slid the page back across the desk like it was someone else's problem. It's not dated, he said, not witnessed, and we can't confirm when it was written. I reminded him that Margot predicted her own death in that letter. He nodded slowly as if he understood what I was saying, but had already decided it didn't matter. We'll file it, he said, but reopening a case requires more than a note. I didn't argue. I just stood up and walked out, gripping the paper tight in my hand. It felt like trying to hold water. Back home, the air inside the house was heavier than usual, like it hadn't moved in hours. The baseboard from the hallway was still pried up, the wood splintered where I'd started digging. I stepped over it without thinking and headed to the attic again. I'd already searched most of the obvious places behind drawers, under floorboards, inside vents, but something about the chimney throat had stayed with me. The day before, I'd noticed a line of bricks near the back that didn't quite match the rest, newer, less worn. I took the hammer up with me this time, pried gently around the edges until one of the bricks shifted. Behind it was a small iron box, heavy with dust and rusted at the latch. It didn't have a keyhole, just a clasp that stuck for a moment before snapping open. Inside were pages, dozens of them, bound by a ribbon so faded it looked gray. And beneath them a small tape recorder older than anything I'd used, with a cassette already loaded. I brought the box down to the kitchen table and sat in the dim morning light. The tape clicked when I pressed play, and then Margot's voice came through soft, breathy, but steady. "If you're hearing this," she said, "I didn't make it." Her words were slow, careful, like she knew each one might be her last. Gene didn't fall. Arthur pushed him. It was over the vineyard money control, maybe jealousy too. Julian saw it happen. I didn't know what to believe at first, but he was so clear. Said he saw Arthur on the hill with a shovel. Said there was blood. I sat there listening, my hands gripping the edge of the table. Since then, Margot continued, Arthur's been watching us. He walks past the house at night. I've heard footsteps outside Julian's window. I'm afraid. For my son. For myself. If I disappear, it's not by accident. The tape clicked off. I didn't move for a long time. It wasn't theory anymore. Wasn't rumor. It was Margot's voice naming him. That evening I made 3 copies, 2 digital, 1 printed. I sealed the original tape and one of the copies in an envelope and handed it to Callum. I told him plainly, if anything happens to me, give this to the sheriff. Immediately. He looked at me like I'd lost my balance. "Sarah, what's going on?" I didn't explain. Just asked him to promise. He did. Sophie and I went walking the next afternoon. She'd been asking to go back out among the vines, and the weather had finally softened into something gentle, sun-warm, but not harsh breeze, low and constant. She picked sprigs of mint and wildflowers as we walked. Asked if Julian might have liked mint. I told her I thought he would have. That's when I heard it. The sound behind me too heavy for a bird, too slow for the wind. I turned just in time to see Arthur stepping out from behind a row of vines. His face was drawn, tight eyes locked on mine. He moved fast. I felt a cloth pressed to my mouth, the sharp bite of chemicals. Everything tilted. My knees gave out. Sophie screamed, and then there was nothing. When I woke up, the air was stale and close. Dust clung to every surface. The room was dim, lit only by a single lantern in the corner. My wrists were tied behind me, nylon cutting into the skin. Sophie was beside me, curled up small, her face streaked with tears. Arthur was pacing his footsteps, cracking the warped floorboards. He wasn't yelling, just muttering. "You had no right to dig it all back up," he said. I told him he didn't have to do this. He stopped, looked at me. "Where's the tape?" I told him Callum had it, that it was already with the sheriff. He didn't believe me. His hands shook, then steadied. "It should have ended back then," he said, "if Margot had just kept her mouth shut." He turned to Sophie, and his voice dropped. "What did you say the boy's name was?" She didn't answer right away. Then, barely a whisper, "Julian." Arthur stared at her, crouched down, his eyes searching hers like he was trying to read something behind them. "Julian's dead," he said. "He doesn't talk." Sophie shook her head slowly. "He said you heard him. That night." Arthur stood up abruptly and walked to the door. His breathing was uneven now. Something in him was unraveling. Back at the sheriff's office, Callum paced the floor. He'd handed over the envelope, the tape, the journal, the photocopies. Deputies were already marking up a map of the surrounding hills. One of them, a younger woman named Lauren, pointed to a spot on the eastern ridge. "There's an old cabin out here," she said. "Hunting lodge from the 70s. No power, no neighbors, just trees." The sheriff nodded once. "Quiet approach. Let's not scare him." At dawn, Arthur lit the wood stove inside the cabin, smoke curling out through the rusted chimney. He didn't notice the footsteps moving through the trees. Didn't see the line of officers moving into place. Then the knock came. "Arthur Emmons, this is Sheriff Calhoun. Step outside." Slowly. Arthur froze. I sat up, heart pounding. Sophie clutched my side. Arthur shouted through the door. "I've got a child in here. You want her safe? You back off." He opened the door just enough to show himself, one arm wrapped tight around Sophie. "One move," he said, "and she dies." His hand trembled. I didn't wait. There was a cast iron pan left on the floor. I shifted my weight, lunged forward, and slammed into his lower back. He staggered, lost his grip. Sophie slipped free and ran. Officers surged forward. One of them tackled Arthur hard, and just like that it was over. The wind through the trees was the only sound left. Inside the interrogation room, Arthur didn't look angry. He just looked empty. "We were clearing the slope," he said. "Jean told me Margot wanted to turn the barn into a gallery. Said I'd get a payout, not a partnership, after all those years." He paused. I already had the shovel in my hand. He stared at the wall. One swing. That was it. I didn't see the boy. He was hiding behind the vines. He rubbed a hand over his face. She had to be silenced too. She knew too much. He didn't cry. He just stopped talking. They took his directions out to the eastern edge of the vineyard, past the trellis line where the ground sloped toward the tree line. It didn't take long. The soil had settled, but not evenly. Underneath a shallow mound, they found Julian, still wearing his corduroy jacket, a rusted belt buckle shaped like a bear, one muddy sneaker. I watched from the edge of the property as they lifted the small form from the earth. Callum stood beside me, his arm around my shoulder. "They can rest now," he said. I nodded, but my eyes stayed fixed on the vines and the stretch of land that had swallowed the truth for 30 years. Something told me the land hadn't said everything yet. After they carried Julian's remains up the hill after Arthur was taken away in cuffs, the vineyard felt strangely still. Not peaceful, just emptied. Like the land was waiting to see what we would do next. We stayed quiet for a few days. Sophie didn't ask questions, and I didn't offer answers. Callum took care of most of the outside work, walking the rows in silence, checking irrigation lines, brushing the dust from old trellis posts like he was trying to remind the vines they weren't forgotten. Inside the house, I found myself staring at corners again, listening harder than I used to. There was nothing left to find, but I couldn't let go of the feeling that something had slipped past us. A week went by, then 2. Deputies came and went, mostly finishing paperwork, sometimes bringing boxes of items from the cellar and attic that were being held as evidence. Sheriff Calhoun checked in once, thanked me for coming forward, said the DA was preparing charges. His voice was steady, but his eyes lingered too long on Sophie, like he was still measuring what she might have seen. At night, I sat at the kitchen table flipping through the pages of Margot's journal. Most of them were routine notes about the vineyard's bookkeeping lists of wine shipments, harvest dates, but here and there were fragments that didn't belong. Scribbled thoughts, half-finished sentences. Jean spoke to Arthur again today. Tone sharp. Another page. Julian won't sleep in his room. Says the man keeps coming back. And this one just 3 words. It's starting again. I don't know when it shifted exactly, when my focus turned from what had already happened to what hadn't. But the more I read, the more I felt like Margot had left pieces behind that weren't just about the past. There were pages that seemed to stop mid-sentence. One mentioned an employee I hadn't heard of. Another had a folded corner, but no follow-up entry. I went to the old file cabinet in the den where I'd kept copies of the ownership records and scanned back through them. There was a name, Eduardo Lobo, listed once in a 1982 payroll summary, again on a shipment invoice from the following spring. I hadn't seen it anywhere else. The next day, I called the clerk's office, then the local union. Took most of the afternoon, but eventually someone gave me a number in Paluma. It was an older listing, landline only. I tried it anyway. A man answered on the 3rd ring. "Mr. Lobo," I asked. "Yes?" he said, cautious. I told him who I was, that I'd bought the old Dial property, and that I was looking into some of the records. There was a long pause before he answered. "That was a long time ago." I asked if he'd be willing to meet. He said yes eventually. Gave me an address outside of town. said to come the next day around noon. His place was small, set back behind a rusted gate with tomato plants climbing up a fence and wind chimes stirring in the breeze. He met me on the porch. Weathered face, white hair under a baseball cap, hands that looked like they'd built and rebuilt things more than once. He didn't invite me in, just motioned to a chair across from him and poured tea from a cracked thermos. I told him we'd found Margot, that it was Arthur, that we knew about Julian. He didn't react right away, just looked out toward the trees behind his yard. I knew that day would come, he said quietly. He told me he was young then, had a wife, 2 kids, did his job, kept his head down. Gene was a good man, he said, kind. Arthur was different. I asked if he believed Arthur had something to do with what happened. Eduardo didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into a drawer beside his chair and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a photostaff from the vineyard late summer 1982. Margot and Jean stood near the front arms touching. Eduardo was in the back row. Arthur stood to the side, hand on Julian's shoulder. Margot came to me once, he said Jean didn't fall, said Julian saw what happened. His voice tightened, said she was scared, that someone was walking near the house at night. She planned to go to the sheriff. She never made it. I asked why he hadn't come forward. His jaw shifted. Arthur paid well, had a temper. I saw what he did to a contractor once just for showing up late. I thought if I said anything, I might disappear too. He looked at me then, eyes steady, clearer than I expected. Be careful, Mrs. Rhodes. Arthur's in custody now, but that doesn't mean it's over. You start turning over old ground, sometimes it keeps going deeper. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the trees move outside. The heater kicked on with its usual groan. I kept thinking about the missing journal pages, about how Margot had written that she made copies, that she hid them where no one would think to look. I hadn't found anything else in the attic, nothing behind the walls or under the floorboards. But there was one place I hadn't checked closely. The barn. Just after sunrise, I pulled on my boots and walked out. The grass was still damp, the light coming in low and gold across the rows. The barn door creaked open with its usual complaint. Inside it smelled of dust and dry wood. I walked along the back wall, scanning the rafters, the beams. Then something caught my eye. Near the base of an old wine rack, under a pile of broken crates, a board didn't match the others. It was looser, slightly warped. I knelt, pried it up with the claw of a hammer. Underneath, wrapped in a plastic sheet, was a small folder. Inside were pages. Margot's handwriting again. Copies. Dated entries. Some that hadn't been in the first box. I sat there on the barn floor reading. One line stood out more than the rest. It was written in red ink. If they tell you it was grief, don't believe them. It was fear, and fear doesn't vanish when the body is gone. I took the folder back inside, laid it out on the kitchen table. Callum came in while I was sorting them. He watched quietly, didn't say much. I showed him the final page. He just nodded. What now? He asked. I looked back toward the barn, then out to the vineyard where the light was breaking across the soil. We keep going, I said. We find the rest. But later that night, as I stood by the hallway window, I noticed something I hadn't seen in months. A shape down by the trellis line. Not moving. Just there. I blinked, looked again. It was gone. I didn't mention it to Callum. Not yet. But in the morning, I'd ask Sophie what she'd drawn lately, and I'd check the locks again just in case. The morning after I saw the figure near the trellis line, I walked the perimeter of the vineyard before sunrise. It was barely light out, just that faint blue glow that hangs in the air before the sun pushes through. I brought a flashlight, but I didn't use it. The quiet was so complete it felt like even the trees were holding their breath. I found nothing. No prints, no footprints in the soft dirt, no snapped twigs. But something about the soil looked off near the edge of the property where the old slope turns down toward the creek bed. It was loose in patches, turned like someone had walked through and tried to smooth it over again. I marked the spot with a small piece of twine and went back inside before Sophie woke up. Callum was already in the kitchen, coffee half poured, flipping through paperwork from the Vineyard Co-op. He asked if I'd slept, and I told him I had. Neither of us mentioned the envelope on the counter, the one holding the second tape and Margot's last journal pages. We both knew it was there. We both knew why. After breakfast, Sophie wandered off to the den with her sketchpad. She hadn't said much in the last few days, but I noticed she kept drawing the same shape over and over. Not a person this time. A pattern, tight looping spirals with a smaller mark tucked just beneath them. I asked her what it was, and she shrugged. It's the thing Julian said his mom hid. The other one. But I don't know where it goes. She didn't look up from her page. I think he's trying to show me. I took the drawing upstairs and laid it next to Margot's journal, flipping through the older entries again. There was one passage from late 1983 that had stuck with me before, but it read differently now. I've hidden the rest in the bones of this house, she wrote. Not the ones they expect. Somewhere low near water. Somewhere no one checks anymore. I read it twice, then glanced back at Sophie's drawing. The loops. The smaller mark below. I got in the car and drove into town. At the county records office, I asked for original blueprints of the Dial property house barn cellar outbuildings, anything they still had from the zoning files. The clerk took his time flipping through drawers and binders until he pulled out a roll of brittle paper sealed in a cardboard tube. Only copy, he warned as he handed it over. I unrolled it at the nearest table. Most of it was standard, a main floor plan, crawl space, water lines. But then I noticed a small note near the southeast corner of the house. Drainage tunnel sealed 1979. The line connected to a crawl space under what was now our laundry room. It ran downhill toward the trellis line, toward where I'd seen the figure. That afternoon, while Callum was working on the vineyard map in the den, I pulled back the laundry machines and pried up the boards behind them. There was a crawl space entrance, almost invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. I opened it and slipped inside, crawling low with a flashlight in one hand. The air was dense dirt and insulation, and the cold smell of damp earth. About 10 feet in, I found a tunnel entrance. It wasn't tall, maybe 4 feet across, but it was lined with old bricks and curved gently downhill. I followed it. After maybe 20 yards, I hit a dead end. The brick had crumbled in parts, and something had collapsed near the back roots, breaking through soil seeping in. But wedged between the wall and the last intact beam was a sealed tin box. I pulled it free and crawled backward, trying not to think about how long it had been down there or what might be behind me. Back in the kitchen, I laid the box on the counter. It was lighter than I expected. Inside were more journal pages. These newer, more frantic, the handwriting hurried. There was also a second cassette. Same handwriting on the label. Margot's voice again. I played it. If this one's been found, I'm gone, she said. I know it. I can feel it. Jean didn't fall. Julian saw it. Arthur knows. I've told the sheriff, but he doesn't believe me. He says I'm grieving, but grief doesn't leave footprints. Her voice cracked. Julian told me he saw Arthur by the cellar door the night before Jean died, said he had something wrapped in canvas, a shovel. I should have asked more. I should have written it down sooner. There was a pause, then the soft scrape of a chair. If you're the one hearing this, whoever you are, I need you to believe me. They'll say I imagined it, that I was broken. But I was scared, and scared people don't lie to themselves. They lie to stay alive. I pressed stop and sat with the box open beside me. The second tape, the drawings, the sealed drainage tunnel, it all connected. Not to what had already happened, but to what Margot had been trying to prevent. She hadn't just documented what Arthur did. She'd tried to leave a record in pieces, scattered and hard to trace because she didn't think anyone would believe her outright. And she was right. No one had. Not the sheriff back then, not the neighbors, not the deputies who filed the report without follow-up, not until we moved in. That night I made another copy of the new tape. I labeled it, sealed it, placed it next to the first envelope in the fireproof box we kept in the hallway cabinet. Callum asked what it was, and I told him just records, that we might need them. He nodded and didn't press. He'd started doing that more quietly, stepping back when he sensed I wasn't finished. I think he understood that I needed to see it through even if he wasn't sure how much further there was to go. Sophie fell asleep on the couch, one of her drawings still tucked under her hand. I carried her upstairs, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and left the door cracked just enough to hear if she woke. Back downstairs, I sat by the window with the tape in my lap, listening to the wind shift outside. The same low groan through the trees, the same chill that drifted in when the night turned fully dark. I was starting to understand what Margot meant about fear leaving a trail. It doesn't vanish. It settles. It waits. And sometimes it points towards something that isn't finished. The next morning, Sophie handed me a new drawing, a building this time, small, square, slanted roof. I asked her where she'd seen it. She just pointed out the window. By the far vines, she said. The place where Julian said his mom left the other part. He said it's still there, but he doesn't like to go near it. I looked at the picture again. There was a door at the front, slightly open, and something dark inside. I asked her if she'd drawn what was in there. She shook her head. I couldn't see it, but I think he wants you to. That morning, after Sophie showed me the drawing, I walked the vineyard alone. The air was dry and still, the soil brittle underfoot. I followed the rows past the trellis line and into the eastern slope where the land leveled out again before dipping into a shallow patch of trees. Sophie's sketch had shown a structure I didn't remember. A square building slightly off balance with a door that hung open just enough to hint at something inside. I kept scanning the horizon, walking slowly until I reached the farthest point we'd cleared last spring. That's where I saw it. A shed sun-bleached and tilting, almost swallowed by tall grass and scrub. Its roof sagged in the middle and one shutter had fallen off completely. From the road, you wouldn't see it. Even from the house, it would just blend into the slope. I stood a few yards back and took it in, not just what it was, but what it had become. Forgotten. Undisturbed. The door was jammed but not locked. I pulled gently until the latch gave and stepped inside. The smell hit first old earth mold, something sour beneath it. The light came in through slats in the wall, falling in uneven bands across the floor. There were no tools, no boxes. Just one low table, a rusted chair, and something in the corner covered with a plastic sheet. I stepped closer, peeled it back. Beneath was an oilcloth bundle, frayed and stained at the edges but tightly wrapped. I crouched down and unrolled it slowly. Inside were more papers, water-damaged but legible, and a small notebook bound with red thread. I recognized the handwriting before I read a word. Margot had written everything. These entries weren't like the ones from before. They were focused, structured. She had written out full names, dates, her own timeline. There were sketches of the cellar, diagrams of the drainage system, a list of people who had worked at the vineyard that year, including Eduardo, and someone else, C. Fallon. Contracted bottling assist, August-October '83. I didn't know the name. It hadn't appeared in any of the files I'd seen. She underlined it twice and drew an arrow. At the bottom of the page, she'd written, said he saw something. Changed his story. Arthur paid him to leave. I stayed in the shed for over an hour, reading every page. She hadn't just documented what happened, she had created a record of who knew, who backed away, who watched and said nothing. She mentioned someone at the bank, a notary who changed the date on a property transfer. Another man from the bottling line who stopped returning her calls. And then, under a page torn along the edge, I found something that stopped me. A receipt. Dated November 7th, 1983. One item listed custom locking panel, bottling cellar wall, paid in cash. signed only A.E. I folded everything carefully and brought it back to the house. Callum was outside checking irrigation lines, Sophie still upstairs. I laid the papers out on the dining room table, lining them up one by one, and started taking photographs. Every page, every name. I uploaded them to a drive and backed it up on a flash. I printed a full copy and sealed it in another envelope. The house felt cold even in the light. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had known these pages were hidden and that someone had walked away from them on purpose. That night, I waited until Callum was asleep and returned to the cellar. I hadn't gone down there since the day they pulled Margot's body from beneath the kitchen floor. The new boards creaked slightly under my boots, and the bulb above the stairs flickered once, then steadied. The far wall had been patched by the county crew, a fresh layer of cement poured and painted to cover the old fracture. But something felt off about it. I stepped closer, running my fingers along the edge where the new section met the original stone. The temperature changed there, cooler, damp. I knocked lightly, hollow. I went back upstairs and grabbed a rubber mallet and flashlight. When I returned, I tapped lightly along the base of the wall, moving slowly from left to right. Then I heard it a dull echo different from the rest. I stopped, tapped again. Same sound. I pressed against the wall, pushed gently. Nothing moved, but the panel gave just a fraction of an inch. Enough. I pried at the edge with a screwdriver, and slowly the piece shifted. Inside was a cavity, maybe 4 feet deep, 2 feet across. It was empty, but the floor of it was covered in dust that didn't match the rest of the cellar. Lighter, finer, like it had been disturbed. I didn't go further. I resealed it and stepped away. If anything was left down there, it wasn't mine to move. In the morning, I called Deputy Barron, told her what I'd found, what I'd read. She listened, said she'd send someone out to document it. I heard the hesitation in her voice, the kind that creeps in when something gets too close to implicating more than just the one person already in custody. I asked her if she knew the name Fallon. She said she'd look into it. I didn't ask if she believed me. I already knew she was doing what she could, but I also knew what it meant when someone says we'll take it from here. It means they're hoping you'll let go. But I didn't. I went back to the photo I'd printed from the archive, the one of the staff lined up at the harvest table. I hadn't looked at it closely in weeks, but now I studied each face, trying to match Margot's notes to the expressions frozen on that page. The man next to Arthur, half-shadowed and wearing a ball cap low over his eyes, I hadn't noticed him before. But he was standing too close, his posture stiff, his hands clenched at his sides. No name in the caption. I flipped the photo over. In the margin, faint pencil lines, Fallon. Left 2 weeks later. I didn't sleep that night. I moved through the house, checking doors, windows, the baseboards I hadn't touched in months. Sophie's room was still her blanket pulled to her chin. I stood in the hallway and listened. The wind was quiet. The pipes didn't knock. But around 3 a.m., I heard a sound outside, faint metallic, like something tapping lightly against the side of the barn. I looked out the window. Nothing there. But the next morning, near the base of the trellis, I found something wedged between the boards. A small strip of paper. No writing. Just 3 numbers, 1983. Folded twice. Crisp at the edges. And tucked inside a photograph I hadn't seen before, Margot Julian, and someone standing just outside the frame. Only part of his arm was visible, hand resting on Julian's shoulder. Same one as in the other photo. Only this time Margot wasn't smiling. The photo stayed on the table for days. I'd walk past it, glance at it sideways, then move on. But the hand, whoever it belonged to, never left my mind. I sent a scan to Deputy Barron with a short note. "Does this look like Fallon?" She didn't reply. Not at first. But 3 days later, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a copy of an incident report from 1984, A laborer named Colin Fallon had filed a statement at the sheriff's office in late November, just 2 weeks after Jean's death. He claimed he'd seen something unusual near the Dial bottling cellar, described as a covered item and someone digging after hours. His report had been labeled inconclusive. No follow-up. The file was marked inactive. And at the bottom, in pen case closed insufficient evidence. I flipped it over. A second sheet was paper-clipped to the back. A release form. Fallon had signed it the same day. I looked closer. The witness line had been left blank. That night, after Callum and Sophie were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and laid everything out. The photos, the journal scans, the tape copies. I marked every date, every name, and drew connections with pencil and string like something out of a detective movie. But I wasn't trying to solve a case. I was trying to see the shape of something that had always been buried sideways. Margot had known she wouldn't be believed, not just because of Arthur, but because of everyone else around him. The people who stayed quiet. The ones who watched him build a reputation so clean it could blot out the truth. I called Barron the next morning. Told her I needed to know where Fallon had gone. There was a pause, then she said quietly, "He's in South Dakota. We found him last year. He refused to give a statement, said he didn't want to be involved again. Said it nearly cost him his life the first time." She hesitated. "But he did mention something. Said Margot left him a message once. A note, tucked in his pay envelope on his last day. We couldn't find it. Thought maybe he made it up. I asked her if she still had his original address on file. She did. And it wasn't far. I drove out the next morning past the edges of town, beyond where the land flattens and the sky feels wider. The house was a one-story ranch with a lean-to garage and a satellite dish crooked off the roof. I knocked. Nothing. I waited, knocked again. After a minute, the door opened. A man, late 60s, gray hair, sun-darkened skin, eyes that flicked past me before settling. "You're not the sheriff," he said. I told him who I was, why I'd come. I said Margot had named him, that she'd tried to protect him in her way. He didn't invite me in, but he didn't shut the door either. He said he was there the night Jean died, that he'd been cleaning out the tanks when he heard something above him, a thud, then footsteps, then the door to the old cellar slamming shut. When he came up, Arthur was there, alone. Said there'd been an accident, that Jean had taken a fall. But the next morning, Fallon noticed the ground near the vineyard slope had been disturbed. He told Margot. Quietly. She asked him to leave town, said it wasn't safe. A few days later, she slipped the note into his envelope. He'd never read it. Said he burned it before leaving just in case. I asked if he remembered what it said. He nodded slowly. She said he'd done it before he told me. Said John wasn't the first. That the land had soaked it all up and no one wanted to dig. I stood there for a long time before asking if he'd testify. He didn't answer, just closed the door. But an hour later, I got a text from Baron Fallon's agreed to come in. Tomorrow. That evening, I drove back to the vineyard and walked the perimeter again. Same slope, same trees. Only now I saw it all different. Not as land passed down, but as a field of unmarked silence. Callum was in the cellar checking temperature logs. He looked up when I came in. "Find something?" he asked. I didn't speak, just handed him the photo of Margot and Julian, the one with the arm. I watched his face change slowly, like he was working through a memory he didn't want to name. "That man," he said. "I saw him once, after the funeral. He came by. Said he'd worked with Arthur years ago, asked to walk the vineyard. I said no. I asked if he remembered a name. He shook his head, but his eyes, they were like he was still listening to someone who wasn't there." The next morning, Barron called. Fallon had come in, signed a full affidavit, said he'd testify if it came to trial. She sounded relieved. Then she said something else. "The department's going to start a dig. South side, where the drainage slope was. You were right, there's something off about the soil levels. I'll let you know what we find." I hung up and stood there for a long time, staring out across the vines. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the sky was already warming. The ground looked still, undisturbed, but I knew better now. Sophie woke early. She came downstairs and handed me another drawing. This one was different. A field, a row of trees, and something buried beneath them marked with a red X. "Julian says this is where they took it," she whispered. I asked what she meant. She tapped the center of the page. "Not the body. The thing he drew. The thing his mom hid." I looked closer. The X sat beneath a shape I hadn't noticed at first, a spiral. The same one she'd drawn weeks ago. Only now it was inside something that looked like a jar. I walked back into the cellar one last time, shone my flashlight along the seams of the wall, and in the corner where the stone bowed slightly inward, I noticed something I'd missed before. A hairline fracture running just beneath the support beam. Not part of the new patch. Original. Worn. As if something had been pulled out once, then sealed over. I didn't touch it. Just stared. Somewhere behind that wall I knew was the thing Margot had died trying to name. And whatever it was, it hadn't been meant to stay buried forever. They started the dig just after sunrise. The machines came first county equipment brought in under a sealed permit. No media, no public notice. The slope had always looked normal from a distance, gentle even. But the soil composition told a different story. Barron said there were sediment layers missing, like the land had been disturbed and compacted then left to settle for decades. She stood with her arms folded watching from the edge while the backhoe operator scraped away in slow, careful passes. At about 3 feet down, the metal caught on something hollow. The sound was sharp, unnatural. Everyone stopped. They switched to hand tools after that. I stood behind the orange line heart, pounding even though I already knew. First came the edge of a wooden box, cracked, water-damaged. Then fragments of fabric. Then the outline of a child's shoe. Barron turned toward me, didn't say anything. She didn't have to. They documented everything, photos, tags, measurements. When they lifted the first remains out of the soil, they did it with a kind of reverence. The coroner confirmed it was a child, likely male, roughly 7 or 8 years old. Dental structure was consistent with the records Jean had on file for Julian. A second box was found nearby, smaller, more broken down. Inside was a scattering of bone fragments, adult female, early 30s. Barron waited to say it aloud until the tests came back, but I already knew. Margot had been buried beside her son. Or maybe she'd buried him herself and someone else buried her. Either way, they'd been kept close. Not forgotten. Just hidden. The spiral jar turned up 2 days later. It was found wedged in the cavity behind the cellar beam I'd noticed. The mortar had cracked just enough for the forensic team to slip their camera through. When they pulled it out, they found a metal tin, sealed, rusted, but still intact. Inside were several pages of Margot's handwriting, all tightly folded and wrapped in wax paper. There was no confession. No dramatic retelling. Just a sequence of dates, initials, and short notes. Some of the names matched vineyard employees. Others were less familiar. But the final page caught Barron's attention. At the top, written in red ink, "Insurance files in attic." He kept everything. Barron called for a warrant the next morning. The attic was a crawl space above what used to be Arthur's office. Barron, 2 officers, and a DA rep were present when they broke the seal. It didn't take long. Behind a panel near the insulation, they found 5 sealed boxes, each one filled with documents, policies, ledgers, old maps of the vineyard with certain rows marked in blue. There were notes in Arthur's handwriting that tracked expenses labor records, and buried deep in one of the folders, a receipt for a life insurance payout dated November 26, 1983. Just 4 days after Jean's death. The signature line had been forged, confirmed by 2 separate analysts. The payout had gone into a private account, then withdrawn in increments over the next 10 years, enough to avoid detection. But it was enough. Arthur was arrested that Thursday. He was living alone by then. His wife had passed the year before, and his son had moved out of state. They found him in his greenhouse. Barron told me he didn't ask why they were there, didn't protest, just held out his wrists and nodded. During interrogation, he didn't deny anything, but he didn't confess either. Said very little. When they asked about Margot, he paused a long time, then said, "She should have stayed quiet." When asked about Julian, he closed his eyes, said nothing. The prosecution filed charges within 48 hours, 2 counts of first-degree murder insurance fraud and unlawful burial. The trial took place 6 months later. Barron asked if I wanted to testify about what Sophie had found, but I declined. Not out of fear, just exhaustion. The case didn't need my voice anymore. It had enough on its own. Fallon did take the stand. He spoke quietly, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The jury listened. They watched the photos, read the letters, heard the forensics. And in the end, they delivered a unanimous verdict. Guilty on all counts. Arthur didn't flinch when they read it out. Just stood there, face blank, as if none of it was real. After sentencing, Barron brought me a copy of the file. Not the public version, the full archive. Said I'd earned the right to know all of it. I kept it in a locked drawer for weeks, too heavy to open. When I finally did, the piece that stopped me was a transcript from a 1982 complaint, anonymous, never followed up. It read, "He's hiding something in the slope. I saw him there with the boy. Please check before it's too late." It had been labeled unfounded. No officer was ever sent. No search conducted. Just one more silence added to the pile. Sophie never asked about the trial. I don't know how much she understood or what she saw in those drawings that we didn't. But one afternoon she came to me holding a small square envelope. Said she found it behind a baseboard in her closet. The paper was brittle. Inside was a Polaroid, faded worn. It showed a woman crouched beside a child in the vineyard, both of them smiling. Margot. Julian. The date stamped in the corner read October 9th, 1983, a month before it all ended. On the back in pencil, someone had written, "Home is a place you carry." Sophie asked if we could keep it. I said yes. A week later, we built a small garden on the edge of the slope, nothing grand. Just native plants, quiet, stones, a bench that faced the trees. Barron came by once, sat with me a while, didn't say much. We didn't need to. The land felt different now. Not clean exactly, but honest. And maybe that was enough, at least for now. As we packed up for winter, I looked out across the vineyard one last time and noticed the fog curling low again, soft and familiar. But this time it didn't feel like something waiting. It felt like something settling. Like truth had finally been named aloud. Some nights I still walk the edge of the vineyard just before dusk, when the air shifts and the rows turn quiet. There's a hum that settles across the land around that hour, like everything's holding its breath just for a moment. The slope where they found Margot and Julian doesn't look any different now. The soil's been re-leveled. Native grasses have started to take hold again. But I always know where it is. I never walk over it. I walk beside it. Arthur died in prison 3 months after the sentencing. Heart failure, they said. There was no funeral, no public statement from his family. Barron told me the coroner mailed the ashes to a post office box in Kansas, no forwarding address. I didn't ask any more than that. Some names fade in silence. That's fine by me. Sophie started drawing again. Quiet pieces, trees, water, animals. Nothing like before. She doesn't ask about Gene anymore, but I know she remembers him. Sometimes I catch her glancing toward the road like she expects someone to come walking up the drive. I do that too, more than I admit. We don't talk about the cellar, or the jar, or what was almost missed. But it lives under everything now like the roots that run deep beneath the vineyard. Twisted in, unspoken, but real. The hardest part isn't the truth we uncovered. It's the truth that sat buried for years while people smiled, toasted harvests, and told each other nothing was wrong. That's what stays with me. How quiet evil can be. How long it can wear another man's face and walk around in daylight. But also this, how strong memory is. How it waits even in the minds of children until someone finally listens. Barron stayed on the case until every record was updated. She worked late, didn't let it drift into archive. She said, "We owe them a full name and a place that's theirs," and she meant it. I still see her sometimes. She sends cards in the spring, simple ones. This year's just said, "Still here? Still digging." As for me, I don't believe in closure the way people talk about it. There's no line you cross where things go back to normal. You carry what you learn, you carry who you lose, and if you're lucky, you carry forward what they tried to say before someone cut their voice short. I keep that photo Sophie found in a small frame by the kitchen window. Margot and Julian kneeling in the vines laughing about something we'll never know. They look so at peace in that moment before the quiet turned deadly, before the cellar door closed, before the slope. And still there's a kind of peace in telling it, in saying their names out loud, not as a warning, but as a record, as proof they were here, that someone saw, that someone remembers. If this story stayed with you, share it, say their names, let their silence end here.